My name is Damien, and I drive a cab on weekend nights. It's a job that suited me well, though for reasons most wouldn't understand. There's something about the quiet menace of the night, the solitude of the streets, and the inevitability of human fragility that draws me in. Most nights, I ferry drunken fools, secret lovers, and desperate loners to their respective destinations. But on some nights, the passengers aren't entirely human. The first encounter happened on a bitterly cold Christmas night 2 years ago. The kind of night when frost clings to the edges of windows and silence descends like a shroud. I was driving along Old Mill Road, a desolate stretch of asphalt bordered by gnarled trees and the forgotten cemetery on its outskirts. My headlights cut through the fog, and for a moment, I felt truly alone, a feeling I had come to relish. But as I passed the cemetery gates, I noticed a flicker in my rearview mirror. A shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But then I turned on the interior light. There she was, sitting in the middle of the back seat. An elderly woman, her face lined like old parchment, her gray hair cascading around her shoulders like a veil. She was dressed in a threadbare coat that looked decades out of style. Something about her was unnervingly still. Her gaze wasn't on me, but on the window, staring into the void beyond. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tightly. "Where to, ma'am?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease crawling up my spine. She didn't answer. I repeated the question, louder this time, but again, no response. Her silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was oppressive, like the weight of an unseen predator watching from the shadows. My instinct screamed at me to abandon the car and run, but I've never been one to give in to fear. So, I did what any good driver would do. I turned off the available light and started driving. For several minutes, I navigated the empty streets, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The back seat was empty, as though she had never been there. I pulled over and stepped out of the car, the cold biting through my jacket. I searched the area, but there was no sign of her. Just the silence of the night and the distant rustle of leaves. The second encounter was eerily similar, but somehow worse. It was New Year's Eve, a week after the first incident. The city was alive with fireworks and revelry, but I found myself driving along Old Mill Road again, drawn by some unseen force. As I approached the cemetery, I spotted a figure standing by the gates. An old woman, her hand raised to hail me. Against my better judgment, I stopped. She climbed into the back seat, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone weighed down by time. "Where to?" I asked, my voice colder than the night air. "The old part of town," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The drive was short. Our town isn't large. But the tension in the car made every second feel like an eternity. When I reached the old part of town, a district of crumbling brick buildings and boarded-up windows, I turned to let her know we had arrived. The seat was empty. This time, I didn't stop. I didn't search. I just drove away, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The stories don't end there. They never do. In this line of work, you hear things. My fellow drivers, those who brave the night like me, share their own tales over cups of bitter coffee and the hiss of cigarette smoke. There's Jordan, a wiry man with haunted eyes, who swears he felt long hair brushing against his face while driving an empty cab. And Maria, whose laughter masks her fear, told me about the night a man with no arms or legs appeared in her rearview mirror, his hollow eyes fixed on hers. But the one that stuck with me the most came from Eli, an older driver who's been in the business longer than I've been alive. He spoke of a passenger who got in and asked to be taken to the river. Eli obliged, but when they arrived, the man simply disappeared. The next morning, the police found a body floating in the water, a man matching the description of Eli's passenger. I've come to realize that the night holds secrets, and my cab is a vessel for them. Whether these passengers are spirits, hallucinations, or something else entirely, I'm not sure. But one thing is certain, They're drawn to me, and I'm drawn to them. Perhaps it's because I see them for what they are. Perhaps it's because I've got my own demons riding shotgun. The third time it happened, it wasn't a single passenger but a pair. It was a dreary night in early February, and a thick fog clung to the streets like a living thing. I had just dropped off a fare near the docks and was about to call it a night when I spotted two figures standing at the corner of 5th and Main. They were huddled together, their faces obscured by the gloom. I hesitated, but then one of them raised a hand to flag me down. They climbed into the back seat without a word. One was a young woman, no older than 25, with dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face. The other was a man, older, maybe 40, with a gaunt, hollow-cheeked look. They sat in silence as I asked where they were headed. "To the bridge," the man said finally, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't like it, but I nodded and started driving. The bridge was a good 10 miles out of town, a remote spot known more for its isolation than its beauty. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the occasional murmur between the two in the back. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their voices carried an edge of urgency. When we reached the bridge, I pulled over and turned to tell them we'd arrived. But the back seat was empty. My heart raced as I stepped out of the car, scanning the area. The fog was thicker here, swallowing the world in gray tendrils. I thought I saw movement near the edge of the bridge, but when I approached, there was nothing there. Just the sound of water rushing far below and the oppressive weight of the fog. I returned to my cab and drove off, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who were they? What did they want? And why did they vanish like the others? By the time March rolled around, I had begun to dread the weekend shifts. Still, something compelled me to continue. Perhaps a perverse curiosity, or maybe it was the way these encounters felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't resist solving. Whatever it was, it kept me behind the wheel when most others would have walked away. One particularly rainy Saturday night, I found myself idling near the edge of downtown. The rain cascaded down the windows, blurring the neon lights into streaks of color. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional figure darting between awnings to avoid the downpour. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I spotted him. He stood at the mouth of an alley, half hidden in the shadows. His posture was unnervingly rigid, his head slightly tilted as though he were listening for something. I'd seen plenty of strange characters in my line of work, but there was something about this man that set my nerves on edge. Still, when he raised a hand to flag me down, I hesitated only briefly before pulling over. He got in without a word, settling into the back seat with an unsettling calm. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on me in the mirror. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. "Where to?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his long coat and produced a slip of paper. He leaned forward and placed it on the passenger seat beside me. His fingers were cold and damp, like they'd been submerged in water. I glanced at the note. Written in spidery handwriting was an address I didn't recognize. It wasn't uncommon for people to hand me addresses instead of speaking, especially if they'd had a bit too much to drink. But this man didn't smell of alcohol. He smelled of earth and decay. "Got it," I said, my voice a touch quieter than I intended. As I drove, the silence grew heavier. I'd gotten used to the quiet over the years, but this was different. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against your eardrums and making your thoughts feel too loud. Every so often, I glanced in the mirror. He was always staring, his gaze unwavering. The address led to the outskirts of town, to a neighborhood I'd never had reason to visit. The houses were old and crumbling, their windows dark and lifeless. As I turned onto the final street, I felt a sudden wave of unease. The streetlights here flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the pavement. "Here we are," I said, pulling to a stop in front of a dilapidated house. The yard was overgrown, the fence leaning at odd angles as if trying to escape. I turned to tell him we'd arrived, but the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound, no movement. He was simply gone. I stared at the empty seat, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight. His face was turned toward me, but I couldn't make out his features. And then he did something that made my blood run cold. He raised a hand and pointed at me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I threw the car into drive and sped away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Even as I put miles between myself and that house, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, watching me. A week after the encounter with the man in the alley, I began to notice changes. The air in my cab felt heavier, colder, even when the heater was on full blast. My radio, which I'd always left tuned to a station playing old rock songs, started picking up strange static. Occasionally, in the middle of a song, I'd hear faint whispers. They were too soft to make out, but they sent chills down my spine. One night, as I was cleaning the cab after a shift, I found something on the floor of the back seat, a small, waterlogged notebook. Its cover was blank, the pages warped and discolored from moisture. I flipped it open and found it filled with strange symbols and fragmented sentences, written in the same spidery handwriting as the address the man had given me. I couldn't read most of it, but one phrase stood out, repeated multiple times across the pages. "The bridge is only the beginning." I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Shadows seemed to linger just a little too long, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. It was as if the passengers I'd encountered weren't just random occurrences. They were connected, part of something larger. One night, as I was about to begin my shift, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a single word, "Tonight." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I didn't recognize the number, but deep down, I knew what it meant. Something was coming, and it was too late to turn back now. The night began like any other, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. The cryptic text had been gnawing at the edges of my mind all day. When the clock struck 9, I climbed into my cab and set out into the night, my chest heavy with unease. The city felt different, the streets quieter, the shadows darker, as though the entire world was holding its breath. It didn't take long for the first passenger to appear. She was standing under a streetlight on the corner of Ash and 12th, her figure partially obscured by a thin veil of mist. She was young, with hair so dark it seemed to drink in the light. As she climbed into the back seat, her movements were smooth, almost unnatural. "Where to?" I asked, my voice steady despite the cold not forming in my stomach. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward, her face stopping just short of the rearview mirror. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite describe. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. "Take me to the bridge," she said finally, her voice soft but commanding. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. As I pulled away from the curb, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much larger than myself. The drive to the bridge was uneventful, save for the oppressive silence that filled the car. The woman didn't speak again, and I didn't dare break the quiet. When we arrived, she stepped out without a word, disappearing into the fog that clung to the structure like a living thing. I didn't have long to dwell on her departure before my phone buzzed. Another fare, this one from a location not far from the bridge. I hesitated, the memory of the woman's unsettling presence still fresh in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to ignore the call. It felt inevitable. The next passenger was a man, older, with a face weathered by time and hardship. He climbed into the back seat with a sigh, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "The old cemetery," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded and began to drive. The cemetery was a place I tried to avoid since the encounters had begun, but tonight, avoidance wasn't an option. The man didn't speak again, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter with every mile. When we arrived, he simply vanished, just like the others. The night continued in much the same fashion. A woman in a red coat who wanted to go to the abandoned theater. A child who silently pointed toward the forest at the edge of town. Each passenger was strange in their own way, but they all had one thing in common. They left behind an air of finality, as though their journey with me was part of some grand design. By the time the clock struck 3, I was exhausted, but something compelled me to keep going. As I drove aimlessly through the deserted streets, my phone buzzed again. This time, there was no address, just a single word, "Come." The text sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't ignore it. I felt as though I were being pulled by an invisible thread, drawn toward some unseen destination. Without even thinking, I found myself driving toward the bridge. When I arrived, the fog was thicker than ever, swirling around the bridge like a living entity. I parked the cab and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of water rushing far below. And then I saw them. They were standing in a loose circle at the center of the bridge, their faces hidden by the fog. I recognized some of them, the woman from Ash and 12th, the man from the cemetery, the child from the forest. But there were others, too. Figures I'd never seen before, but who felt strangely familiar. As I approached, the circle parted, and I found myself standing at its center. The figures closed in around me, their faces still obscured. A sense of calm washed over me, mingling with the fear that had been my constant companion all night. One by one, they began to speak, their voices blending into a haunting harmony. They spoke of connections, of lives intertwined by threads unseen. They spoke of choices and consequences, of the bridge between life and death. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The figures faded into the fog, leaving me alone on the bridge. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. But as I returned to my cab and drove away, I knew my life would never be the same. The passengers were gone, but their presence lingered. They had shown me something I couldn't yet comprehend, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the next chapter of this story unfolded. I'd like to say that the encounters stopped after that night on the bridge, that I returned to some semblance of normalcy. But life isn't that kind, and stories like this rarely end neatly. The passengers didn't disappear. They just became harder to predict. Their presence lingered in ways both subtle and overt, pushing me further into the shadowy spaces between the ordinary and the extraordinary. A month after the night on the bridge, I found myself in an all-too-familiar situation. It was a late Friday shift, the streets cloaked in a heavy fog that rolled in without warning. My cab's headlights barely pierced through the mist as I cruised aimlessly, half hoping for a quiet night. Then came the buzz of my phone. The screen lit up with an address I recognized immediately, the bridge. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to turn off the app and go home. But my hands moved on their own, steering the cab toward the destination like a moth drawn to flame. The air grew colder with each passing mile, and by the time I reached the bridge, the fog had swallowed the world whole. I stopped in the same spot where I'd seen the circle of figures. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant rush of water. Then, from the fog, a single figure emerged. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the hood of a long coat. He approached the cab with slow, deliberate steps, and as he climbed into the back seat, I felt a familiar chill creep over my skin. "Where to?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He leaned forward, his face partially visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His eyes were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to pull at something deep within me. "Take me to the beginning," he said. "The beginning of what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You already know," he replied, leaning back into the shadows. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the gear shift. The phrase felt like a key turning in a lock, unlocking memories I didn't remember making. Against my better judgment, I started the drive. The route wasn't one I'd taken before, yet every turn felt instinctive. The city faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by empty stretches of road and towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Time lost meaning as the miles blurred together. The passenger didn't speak again, but his presence filled the cab like a heavy fog. Finally, the road ended at a clearing. In the center stood a house, ancient and decrepit, its windows dark and lifeless. I didn't need to be told this was the destination. The man stepped out without a word, leaving the door ajar. I sat frozen, torn between the urge to flee and the pull of whatever lay within that house. "Come," the man called, his voice carrying an unnatural weight. Against every instinct, I followed. The air grew colder with each step, the house looming larger until it swallowed the sky. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a dark, yawning interior. The man disappeared inside, and I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding. Then I stepped in. The interior was impossibly vast, the walls stretching into darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Shadows moved along the edges of my vision, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. At the center of the room stood a circle of figures, their faces obscured but undeniably familiar. They were my passengers, the ones who had vanished from my cab without a trace. The man who had led me here stepped into the circle, his form shifting and distorting until he became something else entirely. His features dissolved, replaced by a dark, amorphous mass that pulsed and writhed like a living void. "You have served your purpose," the voices said in unison, emanating from the circle. "The bridge has been built." "What bridge?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Between worlds," they replied. "And you are the ferryman." The realization hit me like a blow. Every passenger, every strange encounter, they had all been steps in a journey I hadn't understood until now. I had been chosen, not by chance, but by design. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now, you choose," the voices said. "Remain here and become one of us, or return and continue your work. The bridge requires a keeper." I looked around the room, at the figures that had once been people, and then at the dark mass that pulsed at the center. The weight of the choice pressed down on me, but in the end, there was only one path I could take. "I'll go back," I said. The figures nodded, and the world dissolved into darkness. I woke in my cab, parked at the edge of the bridge. The fog had lifted, and the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But the chill in the air and the faint whispers in the back of my mind told me otherwise. I started the engine and drove back into the city, the weight of my new role settling over me. The passengers would come again, and I would be there to guide them. Not because I wanted to, but because it was what I was meant to do. The bridge had been built, and I was its keeper.